Rockwell's new 9-speed and 13-speed manual transmissions are the result of our ongoing commitment to respond to customers' drivetrain needs. Now, these are heavy-duty transmissions, designed and built to meet the increasing performance demands of a rapidly changing industry. Translated, well, that means more vehicle uptime, longer service life, and less maintenance. In short, Rockwell's new transmissions have greater durability, quality, and reliability. Both the 9 and 13-speed manual transmissions utilize state-of-the-art air-shift systems, which provide fast range shift performance and a high degree of resistance to contamination. In today's presentation, we'll show you how the air-shift systems for both transmissions work. We'll also discuss troubleshooting techniques, as well as the removal and installation of key components. More specifically, on the 9-speed air shift system, we'll cover the operation of its air supply and delivery systems and the low and high range operation. Now, troubleshooting techniques will cover the air supply system, filter and regulator assembly, slave valve, range cylinder, and the selector valve. And finally, we'll give you tips for removing and installing air lines and the selector valve. We'll also look at the air shift system on the 13-speed transmission, including the operation of its air delivery system and the high range with splitter in both direct and overdrive. We'll show you how to troubleshoot the selector valve and high and low range and splitter. And finally, we'll discuss the removal and installation of the selector valve. Now, although we'll be covering a fair amount of information in today's program, Rockwell does provide a complete set of maintenance manuals that cover each area in detail. Refer to Maintenance Manuals 26A, B, C, and D for additional information. In this module, we'll look at the air shift system on the 9-speed manual transmission and give you an overview of system flow and operation. To begin, although the air shift system is readily accessible on both the 9 and 13-speed transmissions in your vehicle, we will be working with the display model for component identification and maintenance procedure purposes. So let's take a look at how the air shift system operates. Pressurized air from the vehicle enters the inlet port of the air filter and regulator assembly. A brass filter element located in the assembly keeps contamination from entering the system. The regulator's purpose is to regulate the truck system's air pressure, which is coming in at 90 to 120 pounds per square inch to between 60 and 65 pounds per square inch. A delivery port on the filter and regulator assembly sends the air pressure to the slave valve in the air delivery system. The slave valve supplies air pressure to a port in the selector valve and 2 ports on the range cylinder. In the low range, air pressure from the slave valve's supply port enters the supply port of the selector valve. The air pressure then comes from the pilot port of the selector and returns to the pilot port on the slave valve. This pressure forces a spool valve inside the slave valve to move rearward, directing the air to flow through to the low-range port on the range cylinder. Now, once there, air pressure acts on the forward side of the piston. The piston then moves to the back of the range cylinder, then moves the shift fork to put the transmission into low range. In the high range, pressurized air is directed from the filter and regulator assembly to the slave valve, then to the supply port on the selector valve. The selector valve, which is in the closed position, does not allow the air to continue to flow down to the pilot port, but rather the air in the pilot port line is exhausted through the exhaust port in the selector valve. All this air pressure is now on one side of the slave valve. This causes the spool valve inside the slave valve to shuttle, directing air pressure to the high port on the range cylinder. The air from the range cylinder and the line back to the slave valve is then exhausted out of the exhaust ports on the slave valve. Once there, Air pressure from the high range port acts on the rearward side of the piston, which moves the piston to the front of the range cylinder and also moves the shift fork to put the transmission into high range. Well, that wraps up this section on the air shift system flow. Now, let's move on to the next module, where we'll troubleshoot some of the components of the air shift system. In this module, we will show you troubleshooting techniques on the 9-speed manual transmission for the air supply system, filter and regulator assembly, slave valve, selector valve, and range cylinder. Now remember, when working on these components, it's a good idea to follow safe working procedures, such as wearing safety glasses for your protection. Now to troubleshoot the air supply system, begin by checking the air gauge in the truck cab to see if it indicates low air pressure. If it does, you'll need to check for leaks in the following areas: at the compressor, reservoir, drain valves, and air lines and fittings. Make sure that you tighten any loose fittings and replace all leaking air lines. Also, any excess moisture should be removed from the system's drain valve daily, and the air dryer assemblies filter checked. Finally, to repair any truck air system components, make sure that you follow the procedures stated by the vehicle's manufacturer. The filter and regulator assembly is the next area to check for leaks. Any leaking or damaged fittings should be tightened or replaced. If air is leaking from the end cap, it should be tightened to 10 to 15 foot-pounds. If it's still leaking, remove system air. Remove the end cap. And inspect the O-ring. When replacing a damaged O-ring, make sure a silicone lubricant is applied. Once you have replaced the O-ring and reassembled the filter regulator, apply air pressure. If air continues to leak, check the breather port on the bottom of the regulator and filter assembly. The assembly will have to be replaced if air is leaking from the breather port. Now, it's also very important to inspect the filter element located inside the filter regulator assembly. It should be replaced if the contamination cannot be removed, and the air supply system checked for the cause of the contamination. To check for proper air system pressure, first, charge the system. Then, with an air gauge, check for incoming air from the vehicle to the filter and regulator assembly. It should be between 90 and 120 psi. If it's not, check the OEM manual for proper service procedures. Next, I'll put the air gauge in the air line between the filter and regulator assembly and the slave valve. You'll notice that Rockwell uses quick connect design fittings for easy serviceability. I'll install the gauge. Now charge the system. The air pressure must be between 60 and 65 psi. If not, look for these problems: a clogged filter or a bad regulator assembly. To check for leaks in the slave valve, begin by checking for correct plumbing, making sure the air system lines are hooked to the correct ports. For example, this red 1/4-inch air line comes from the delivery port on the air filter regulator to the supply port of the slave valve. And the black 1/4-inch line delivers air from the slave valve to the low port of the range cylinder. Finally, the blue 1/4-inch line delivers air from the slave valve to the high port of the range cylinder. Then, make sure you have air system pressure. If air is leaking, follow this procedure. Inspect the necessary fittings, making sure to tighten any loose ones or replace any damaged ones. Inspect the tubes and replace any that leak. Oh, by the way, when cutting the tubing for replacement, make sure it's cut square on the ends. If not, this could also cause a leak. Next, make sure that all the fasteners attaching the slave valve to the transmission are tight. If the slave valve continues to leak, replace it. Our next component for troubleshooting is the selector valve. The selector valve allows the driver to choose the high or low range in the auxiliary section of the transmission. To test it, make sure there is air system pressure. Remove the cover and the set screw. Then, disconnect the black air line from the pilot port. With the valve in low range, check for airflow. Then do the same with the valve in high range. Air should not be flowing now. If the valve is not operating in this way, replace it. Again, remember to check the plumbing. Make sure that the correct lines are hooked up to the correct ports. Our final component for troubleshooting is the range cylinder. When checking for leaks, you'll follow the same type procedures as you did for the slave valve. Begin by inspecting all fittings. Tighten and replace them as necessary. Inspect the tubes. Make sure they're not crimped, blocked, or damaged in any way. Replace as necessary. To make sure the range cylinder is operating correctly, disconnect the air line to the high range port and apply pressure to the low range port by putting your selector valve in the low range. If air is leaking from the high range port, there could be a loose piston nut, or the piston or O-ring could be damaged. If you're replacing the O-ring, make sure you use a silicone lubricant. Replacing these parts is made easy with Rockwell's two-piece range cylinder housing and by using Rockwell's Maintenance Manual 26A for proper service procedures. So before we wrap up this module, let's review. Let's say a driver complains of slow range shifting. You'd follow these procedures. Check for proper airline connections. Check for proper air pressure being supplied to the transmission and to the shifting components. Make sure the selector valve or shift knob is operating properly. And finally, make sure air is not leaking from the piston or O-ring and the piston nut is not loose. In this module, we'll show you the proper and easy way to remove and install air lines and the selector valve on the 9-speed manual transmission. To begin, try to replace any air lines with lines of the same color. But more importantly, make sure they are connected to the right ports. After removing air from the air supply system, remove the air line by using a small screwdriver or other appropriate tool to push in on the quick connect fitting and pull the air line out. To install a new air line, first make sure you cut the tubing ends off squarely. This will help to ensure proper installation without any leaks. Then push the tube into the fitting until it touches the fitting's bottom. The quick connect will automatically lock. Now charge the system and check for leaks. Now, to remove the selector valve or shift knob, you first have to remove the air from the supply system. Then, remove the set screw that holds the cover to the selector valve assembly. Then slide the cover down the shift lever. Mark the lines to the selector valve, disconnect, and remove them. Now loosen the jam nut that holds the valve to the top of the shift lever. Now remove the valve, the jam nut, and finally, remove the cover from the shift lever. To install the new selector valve, begin by installing the cover and the jam nut on the lever. Then correctly position the new valve on the shift lever. And tighten the jam nut. Now the vehicle's OEM will determine what color airlines are used. What you need to make sure of is that the airlines are matched to their proper ports. In this example, install the black airline to the pilot port and the red airline to the pilot supply port. Finally, install the cover and the set screw. And don't forget to charge and check the air system. Now, one final point before we wrap up this module. The airlines you'll be replacing will be either 1/8 inch or 5/32, depending upon your vehicle OEM. If the 5/32 is used, a sleeve adapter will be needed. The air shift system on Rockwell's 13-speed manual transmission has the same advantages as the 9-speed, such as enclosed spool valves that resist corrosion and contamination, and quick-release air lines that are color-coded for easier installation. Both the 9 and 13-speed transmissions use an air shift system to select between low and high range. But the 13-speed offers a little more high-range versatility. Here's how the 13-speed transmission is different. The first 4 gears operate with the air shift range selector in low, exactly like the 9-speed transmission. But after selecting the high range, gears 5 through 8 make use of an additional splitter circuit to split the gears between direct drive and overdrive. This splitter circuit consists of a continuous air supply from the regulator, a shuttle valve, and the splitter piston. The continuous air supply is routed to the front of the splitter piston and the shuttle valve. When the shuttle valve is open, it routes the air supply to the rear of the splitter piston, causing it to overcome the front side pressure and move the splitter piston into the direct drive position. Put together, this is how the entire system works. When low range is selected, air is routed from the supply port of the slave valve to the selector valve and into the pilot port of the same slave valve. This causes a spool valve to in turn route air pressure to the low range side of the range cylinder, which shifts us into low range. While in low range, air is directed to the front side of the shuttle valve, forcing it to remain in the open position. This locks the transmission into direct drive in the auxiliary section. When the selector valve is moved to the high range position, air pressure is exhausted from the low range port and pressurized to the high range port of the range cylinder. This pressure then shifts the range piston into the high range position. This also exhausts the air pressure from the front of the shuttle valve. However, constant air from the filter regulator keeps the shuttle valve in the open position. Therefore, the system remains in direct drive. Once the splitter valve on the shift knob is moved into the overdrive position, air is supplied to the rear of the shuttle valve. This closes the valve, forcing the air to exhaust on the rearward side of the splitter piston. The continuous air pressure acting on the forward side of the splitter piston then moves the piston into the overdrive position. As you can see, the shuttle valve is one of the main components that makes the system work. Now let's move on to our troubleshooting module. In this module, We'll troubleshoot a few key areas on the 13-speed manual transmission. They include correct operation for the low and high ranges, the splitter, and also the selector valve. But before we begin, it's important to first repeat the system checks we performed on the 9-speed. Check for air pressure, correct plumbing, and any leaks in the air supply system, filter and regulator assembly, slave valve, selector valve, and range cylinder. Finally, make sure to check the splitter for any leaks, obstructions, or improper fittings. In order to troubleshoot the low range on the 13-speed, with air applied, put the selector valve in low range and listen for the piston to move toward the range cylinder cover. Then, remove the air line to the high range port of the range cylinder. If air is leaking, inspect for a damaged O-ring, damaged piston, or a loose nut. Oh, by the way, if the piston didn't move when you shifted to low range, the shift shaft or shift assembly located inside the range cylinder will need servicing. See Rockwell Maintenance Manual 26C for proper servicing procedures. Now, to see if the high range is operating correctly, begin by making sure that the air shift system is charged. Then, remove the air line from the low range port. If air is leaking, it could be the shuttle valve, the piston, the O-ring, or a loose piston nut in the range cylinder. Refer to Maintenance Manual 26D for proper servicing. Now, to check overdrive, place the red button in the overdrive position. Initially, you will hear a small amount of exhaust air. However, if you hear a continuous amount of air leaking from the low range port, either the shuttle valve, the piston, or piston O-rings may be damaged, or you may have a loose piston nut in either the range cylinder or splitter cylinder, or both. The selector valve allows the driver to choose the high or low range and the direct or overdrive range. Troubleshooting the selector valve in the high and low ranges requires the following. After removing the cover and sliding it down the shaft, disconnect the air tube from the pilot port of the selector. Now, just like the Rockwell 9-speed, we use quick connect design fittings. Then, charge the air system. Put the valve in the low range. Now, air must flow from the pilot delivery port. With the valve in the high range, air should not be flowing. If it is, replace the selector valve. Finally, always remember to check the plumbing on the air system, making sure the proper lines are connected to the proper ports. Now, to test the direct and overdrive ranges of the selector valve. Begin by putting the blue lever in the low range and the red button in direct. Now, you should not be able to actuate the red button into overdrive. If you can, replace the selector valve because the interlock is not functioning properly. Next, disconnect the air tube from the splitter port. With the system charged, put the selector in high range, and with the red button still in direct, air should not be flowing from the splitter port. If it does, replace the selector valve. Now, with the selector valve still in high range, put the red button in the overdrive position. Air should have been flowing from the splitter port. If not, replace the selector valve. Oh, by the way, when you are in high range and overdrive, you will not be able to put the blue lever into low range. If you can, make sure you replace the selector valve. Finally, check the system for correct plumbing, making sure all lines are installed properly. Our final module in this program will show the proper procedures for installing the selector valve on the 13-speed manual transmission. Now, to begin, remove the 13-speed selector valve in the same manner you did the 9-speed. Now, for additional information, check the procedures in Maintenance Manual number 26D. Then, to replace the selector valve, begin by installing the cover and the jam nut on the shift lever. Then, the valve on the shift lever. Now, tighten the jam nut against the lever. Next, connect the tubes to the correct selector valve ports. First, this air line goes from the pilot port on the slave valve to the P port of the shift knob or selector valve. Next, this line goes from the pilot supply fitting of the slave valve to the S port or pilot supply port of the shift knob. Now, connect a line for exhaust air to the E port and run it outside the cab. And finally, connect a line from the splitter housing cover to the SP port. Push the cover against the selector valve until it snaps into position. Then, install and tighten the set screw that fastens the selector valve's cover. All that remains is to run the vehicle and check the system for proper operation. The 9 and 13-speed transmissions that we've shown you today both represent Rockwell's continuing commitment to quality. Now, they were designed to be the best transmissions on the road, and the air shift systems that we've looked at in detail during this presentation are two important reasons why we've succeeded. Now, as in the past, Rockwell remains an industry leader by supplying the highest quality products that respond to our customers' needs.